Hi, welcome to the Ripe Labs podcast. I'm Anastasia Pak, and our guest this time is Daniel Kapellmann from Google Threat Intelligence. Daniel is leading the Information Operations Threat Intelligence team and sharing subject matter expertise about cyber-physical security. His work focuses on cybersecurity issues, particularly on the security of operational technology systems, OT. OT is the hardware and software that monitors and controls devices, processes, and infrastructure, and is used in industrial settings. Think of such important sectors as oil and gas, power and utilities, water treatment, waste management, critical manufacturing. Nowadays, it's no longer an exception for an operational technology system to be connected to the IT network or to the internet. That is why today the systems are also confronted with cyber threats. In this episode, we talk with Daniel about how the convergence of OT with IT systems amplifies risks, cover examples of cyber threats that put critical countries' infrastructure at risk, state-sponsored cybersecurity threats on OT systems, and what practical steps can organizations take to secure these devices. If you enjoy listening to the Ripe Labs podcast, please subscribe on any platform you're listening it to and tell us what you think of the episode in the comments. And now to Daniel. So hi Daniel, thank you very much for joining the Ripe Labs podcast. It's going to be our last episode of the year, so concluding with a very interesting topic, and we're going to talk about new cybersecurity challenges, the OT systems. So can you explain what is OT and what is the difference between IT and OT?
So separating the terms, what it means on the OT side, basically what you mean with OT, which sometimes also they refer as ICS, industrial control systems. They're not the same, but like for simplicity of the argument, they're going to be the same right now. Basically refers to the combination of computing, basically equipment, any type of equipment you're familiar with, and engineering equipment. So basically, it refers more to other type of devices that are the ones that you're using for a physical process to take place. So how I explain it, kind of like the most simple and fun way when you know, like when I'm out just in a party or something, is like remember, I don't know, the last time you went to the airport or you were walking, maybe you did a factory tour or something like that, and then you saw some small screens that have a process, and then you see some boxes that have lights on, lights off, that you're like, I don't know what they do, but sounds interesting. Basically, all of that is the OT process that then you communicate with basically the IT components so that you can go and handle from the distance. Mostly when you refer to IT, that is basically what you're used to: computers, office, network servers, and whatnot. And the combination of both is basically what we're discussing as OT. Now, the last component, in terms of convergence, what it means is simply like in the past, control systems used to be something entirely separate, something that was more, it required more like different protocols. It was manual. It was like isolated, let's say, from other type of networks. And over time, it started getting integrated. It still operates in a very different way. It still has different protocols, different equipment, and everything. But you do have to make a combination because of practicality. From a user perspective, that's basically how you're going to be interacting with it. So in the end, there are a bunch of computers, there's servers, there's virtualization, there's anything that you're familiar with now is interacting with the processes, the physical processes that scaled and that you use for producing anything physical.
So now it is becoming like IoT, or it's still very, very different?
If we were very strict, again, going even a couple of steps back, ICS, industrial control systems, would be just a control system for the physical process. OT would include networking devices, would include the computers, would include like a bit more of this communication. IoT has sort of an overlap, and actually there's another term that some people use that is IIoT, like Industrial Internet of Things,
Okay.
which in the end ends up being all kind of like somehow overlapping, right? Because in the end, depends on what you consider a thing. When you refer more to IoT, most often they refer more like to home devices maybe. And then this one would be more like IIoT, which is again like going to the small processes. But in general, I would say yes and no. Depends on how you define all of those terms.
Can you like actually explain a little bit what your team is doing and just a bit of the...
In the beginning of my organization, like where I work right now, it used to be called FireEye when I got hired. FireEye bought multiple companies, and they bought something called Critical Intelligence, which was basically the first or one of the first organizations that did intelligence investigations for OT, for control systems. And then they were working with this organization. By the time I joined, they were searching for people that could do a bit of everything, tried to communicate the world of IT with OT. That wasn't so So easy before. And then that's when I joined the team. Eventually, many people left, and we started growing from scratch with my manager. Basically, we started growing the team. Once the team was created, it was like several years working with that. And then what we do is basically investigations into OT security. We look into what the actors are doing. We try to work on the attribution, generating detections, basically trying to find everything an organization should know about that. And most recently, I moved a bit. And that's how we ended up now in overlap with hacktivism and OT and more things, right? But yeah.
How this convergence then has evolved over time, and what new vulnerabilities does it introduce to the industrial systems?
First of all, it started becoming more visible. Like we have now more events, more specific attacks where things happened, and in a more simple way, and use some more of those combinations. So, for example, if you go to the oldest examples of attacks, like Stuxnet 2011, Iranian nuclear centrifuge, sounds complicated, right? It was kind of like very specific malware. It goes specifically on certain devices from certain vendors. And then based on that, it basically affected or basically messed up the full production process for many years, right? For a couple of years, it was like that. Like what we saw were like more sophisticated compromises. And then we would expect things to get more complicated. Yeah. But instead, recently, it got more simple. Like we started seeing cases where interacting with devices was easier. And so in the last, let's say 2 years, for example, we even have examples of hacktivists, which are oftentimes considered, let's say, lesser skilled than nation state, actually generating and limited, but some impact or some change in a physical process. That is, for example, the case of a group called CAR, and basically targeting some water facilities in France, Poland, US. Particularly the case of US is an interesting one because I think it was Texas, and there were public statements where they were saying, yes, there was an impact, yes, there was a change, nothing bad happened, yeah, but, it is possible. And why is that possible? Because things are now more connected than before, and therefore more.
So they broke into the systems then remotely, right? So because it is connected now to the network.
Yes, and sometimes, like you said, you have to break into, sometimes you don't, which is the other fun fact. Because from an engineering perspective, from a security perspective, there are two very different things. From engineering perspective, or in general OT, what has been always a priority is what they call into safety. That refers more like to, for example, I'm working with the process has to work well. The users have to, for example, get water that is not polluted. If it's energy, no one should get electrocuted. Those type of things,
safety.
right?
Yeah,
safety. Versus security, which is like no one with the intention to come and modify my process and make it probably unsafe, they should not be able to access. So when you see that difference, the people working with the process, their main mentality is I'm going to make the process work. I'm going to make sure that it's perfectly what I expect. But then trying to do that and at the same time sustain a secure environment is much more difficult. To give a random fake example, if you set a harder password and then someone has an emergency and forgot the password, then basically you're compromising that access to a system that could be critical at the time. That would be even not only OT, but for example, medical devices. If you're a doctor and then you need to remember that password, you're basically messed up. Now, there are many different workarounds, whatever. Obviously, it brings other problems, like people maybe might just write it there and put in a post-it. That's kind of like the balance that you need to find.
So you mentioned the group that was doing the malicious attacks. Are there also sort of some random stories, right? When, it was not really maliciously made, but something really broke down because of a mistake, because of...
In terms of like things that could happen by mistake, there's like many, right? I mean, it's more like accidents happen. I was having this discussion with a friend that it's funny, but I'm like, we're in Europe, and people get so worried. They're like, prepare because there might be a power outage tonight. What are you gonna do? Get some lamp. Be safe. So in general, I don't think there's. I mean, like at least not. There should be for sure, but like nothing like public catastrophic, anything that comes to mind. I think more it's from an actor perspective, what we're seeing right now more than seeing like anything catastrophic that already happened, which was the theory for like, I don't know, probably 10 years ago, it was like everyone was waiting to see like one day someone's going to come and blow up something. It hasn't happened, but actually it's been more utilized as kind of a tool to support other type of objectives, let's say. So, for example, right now during the conflict with Ukraine, there we started seeing the use of these type of attacks, specifically in parallel to other actions that are taking place as part of the conflict. One example, more similar probably than what you're mentioning, where it's not an accident specifically, but it's kind of like not intended, is ransomware, which right now it's probably like people's going to be much more familiar with that. In the beginning, there was no interest from OT perspective. Eventually, when we saw the big cases around 2017, there were a couple companies that said, whoops, suddenly my physical process cannot work because my computers are not working. Maybe I don't have access to the data from my customers. Maybe I don't have access to the machines that are controlling my basically, it's more like a third part of the process, right? And there were some iconic cases. There's a super famous one. Norsk Hydro was one of the first companies that had like this big problem and came out publicly and said, this is what we had. This is how the ransomware impacted. They even have videos telling you, this is how it affected my process. I could not get, I think it was SAP, which basically has information for my customers, for my products, for how am I going to connect that, how much should I produce, what should I do.
What are they doing? What's the company?
Norsk Hydro, I believe it's from Norway, if I remember correctly, and it's a production of steel.
Okay.
Like steel products. Another big example, which is going to be obviously the scary for US, was the Colonial Pipeline. They also had a ransomware case. In the end, there were conjectures on whether it had affected or not. Basically, it did not affect the physical process itself, but given that the ransomware could have affected the process, the company had to turn off some of the devices, basically, disconnect part of the network, and then in order to do the response, and then that resulted again in problems with service, right? The third one is not like a specific case. Well, I think there was a case in one of the ports around Europe, but there were some times where there were a bunch of discussions when the conflict in Ukraine started, and they were discussing, well, there is ransomware in ports as well, like maritime port, and it has affected the processes. So what they were saying is, if you're in Europe, for example, you just need the port, what is it? It's, if I remember correctly, Hamburg, you get Rotterdam, and then you get Antwerpen.
Yep.
And basically you close entire Europe. If those are not working, Europe is not working. So that's where, it becomes kind of like something more strategic, a bigger challenge. That doesn't mean that's going to happen tomorrow, but it means that you need to be prepared.
Protected, yeah. You already actually brought some examples, but maybe if you have some more, we could talk about it. So about the critical infrastructure, such as power grids, water supply systems, and implications of cyber attacks on them. If you can share some real-world examples where such disruptions have occurred.
One that might be concerning that has been discussed kind of like from an ethical standpoint, from a theory standpoint and whatever, was, for example, ransomware in hospitals. Basically, given that depends on the hospital, the network, some of the devices are connected, and also like just information about patients and whatnot. So if you lose access to the information you have, it could basically have bad impacts on the customers. Or if you lose light, for example, like power and whatnot. So there were some cases where that was happening, and actually during some time there was some discussion where some groups, like even the ransomware groups, so basically like criminal groups, were saying like, okay, we're going to have like our code of ethics and we're not going to go for a hospital. Kind of like if you're a hospital and we do it, let us know, we're sorry.
Oh, so they have some sense of humanity apparently.
Some of them. So that's like a case where you like something very like immediate. More like in general, well, there's different types of risk. One of them is against the people working in the process. So this is another one more like, quote, code of ethics. But there's like hacktivist predatory sparrow. That's like the public name, like translation of the name. I think it was also steel production in Iran, like a furnace. So you have like a ton of like burning material. They released a video claiming, we released an attack. This is what we did. Look at the furnace. It falls. It destroys everything, right? That one has not even been like verified. It's impossible to tell if it happened or not as of today. But assuming it happens, there, for example, there was a claim saying like, we have the cameras. You're looking at that. We looked that there was no people involved. But people in the process can be involved. So that's like the first safety problem, right? Like when you are actually working there.
Yeah.
Then outside, like the last layer is kind of like not working there. Then it depends on what you're trying to do. There's a potential and a de facto. Potential is something like 2017, we saw Triton. The Triton attack is one of the, I would say probably the iconic attack. The attackers were able to develop very, very, very specific, highly specific malware for some very specific devices called safety instrumented systems. For context, those devices, you can only have access, the company knows who they sell them to. They are counted. They know it. They have even like physical keys to protect from running. Basically, it was like great job. It was like basically like a couple PhD theses, they put them together, they make this malware, then they manage to compromise the entire organization. And basically they get to the point where if you have control of this box, what you're controlling is the last layer of defense so that you can actually go and basically destroy, like basically cause physical damage to a process. So that is one of the cases where in the end it didn't happen. There were some mistakes, there was incident response. Probably it was not going to happen, but still it was more like preparing to see, can I do it? How would that look like?
But do you think that happened because there was like some data leakage, because they learned about the protocols, because you said it's very sealed, like it's very hard to know what are they using and to not compromise the system?
In this case, I think it was very, very targeted. So sometimes what you get is more like the espionage type of groups doing investigation, looking internally after the reconnaissance, and you can start going through the process and seeing what they have, how does it work. And we actually have a blog where one of our researchers did some analysis on the protocol, and based on the malware, he started kind of like reverse engineering and finding different functions from the protocol. So basically, we're thinking maybe that's what they were doing, just like got a box, like an old box that you can find on, basically you can find it on Amazon Marketplace, whatever. And then they just grabbed it and started reverse engineering, understanding it, and then seeing how it works. And that's also probably the reason why they failed, because the box they were working with had some slight difference that did not work with the different models. So there were some errors in the code, very, very tiny, and for the complexity, it's pretty understandable. So yeah, it's more like, I would say like you do the investigation based on what you want to do. And recently, now getting again back to what's exposed externally, one of the problems is that there's a ton of this information that comes out from organizations like as architecture, processes, passwords, names, whatever you can use for an attack. All of that is coming out not only from the espionage actor, but even, for example, if you get targeted by ransomware, and then all your data goes to ransomware leaks. So we did some investigation into that. We took a look like around a couple hundred cases and found X number of cases where we were able to find all the information about the processes of industrial organizations, what they were exposed, what the passwords were. Some of them were hilarious, in case it's funny. Everything, like who owns the process, what's the product look like, what firmware they have, what version for this, what are the processes they do to, like basically everything you would need to plan something like that.
What are some of the most notable examples of state-sponsored cyber attacks targeting OT systems, and how have these attacks affected critical infrastructure?
So the first one was, again, this one is like going back the museum back in time, 2010, 2011. You get Stuxnet against nuclear Iranian centrifuges. Basically, the idea was that by dropping this malware that was called Stuxnet, what was going to happen is you were going to be able to modify slightly imperceptibly the speed from the centrifuges, and by doing that, basically you mess up with the process, a process that has to run for years so that it can actually bear a result. So that was like the first time, super complicated, moved the world. Right now you can't find it. It's not a joke. You find it in museums. It's even funny. But then after that, let's say 2010, 2011, you get a period of like just investigations. People started looking like what would happen. Could you do something with the grid from the computers? And then after a period of time, let's say 2015, 2016, there were two specific attacks, again, two iconic ones in Ukraine. The first one wasn't as complicated from a malware perspective, but it was more like it was doing kind of signaling, that it's basically just saying like, look, this is what I can do, and I can test it, because no one was going to vouch for Ukraine at that point. Like no one was going to jump in a direct conflict. So they could go and test in a quote safe environment from generating a bigger conflict. In those tests, the first time there's again a public video where you can see the operators. They're looking into the screen with the process and they're like, wait, why is this moving? Like, wait, this is opening, this is closing, like who's doing that? Like, did someone? They're super confused. And what happened was basically it was more a type of compromise where they get access to different machines. They start modifying the process. They basically turn off the power, whatever. And even actually there was an attack against that. Like for example, the emergency lines, so they couldn't call and then help each other. It was basically more kind of starting to explore how would it look like if I want to make something, kind of like breaking up the pieces.
Was it possible to investigate who actually did that? I mean, we kind of probably know behind, but is it somewhere like publicly known fact?
I believe all, but like at least most of the energy attacks, if I remember correctly, have been attributed to something that used to be called Sandworm, which is basically a Russia-sponsored group. Right now it's called APT-44. It was upgraded recently. If you're curious, or again, like for anyone.
We'll leave it in the footnotes for sure. Our audience will be interested.
Cool. Yeah, because there's a blog from this year that's very interesting, and you can see how they do this type of operation with more recent examples. Those are like the historical ones. That same group, which is kind of like probably the most prolific. Like if you see the timeline of OT attacks, basically they're going to be the ones kind of like highlighting. There was this 2015, 2016, there was another with malware, compartmentalized big pieces, again, turn off the power, but now using something more specific to the actual process. Then you jump all the way to the conflict. I'm skipping a bunch, but I like to make it kind of like connected. And during the conflict right now with the case in Ukraine, there were a couple additional events. This one specifically, again,
this group, you mean?
Most likely, I'm not going to make like formal attribution right now, but most likely reuse the same tool to conduct again, like try to generate power outage in at least a couple locations in Ukraine. Yeah, basically it was like reusing one of the modules from this malware to turn off the power. And the point is now it becomes something that in the past seemed more like a test, okay, it's Christmas, I mess up with you. But then right now it's more like I have a conflict, and then if I can turn off the power and do whatever physical action, the impact is much more different.
So they were successful in that then?
I'm going to stick to the official publication. The official publication from Ukraine is that there was no impact, that it was identified earlier. It is difficult to tell if any of these type of attacks, maybe some happen at a certain point and like unvisualized, maybe some have impact, some don't. This one's particularly, public statement is that they didn't. So for what we know, they didn't. We have no reason to doubt that.
But it was just a signal that there is a potential vulnerability, right?
In this case, I think it was more like, let's use it. Like we already have it, let's reuse and see how it works. And everyone thought that once you have exposed this type of malware, that you had shown it, that you had analyzed it, it was going to be obvious they were not going to use it again. But then now you see it actually can be used again. It has changed from being like very specific malware that you run and just happens to being something that's more modular. So it's more like if you have an operator running something modular, it's more difficult from a detection standpoint, because what you need to look for is the behavior itself, but you can't just go and add like a malware signature and see what happens, which maps a lot with kind of like that type of APT behaviors that we've seen a ton associated to this type of group, where they conduct all type of attacks, anything that you can imagine, but just in pieces, so that then in the end you can reach out to whichever outcome you want.
They say that traditional IT cybersecurity strategies are often insufficient for OT environment. So what unique considerations must network engineers address when designing defenses for OT systems? I think
from OT standpoint, there are many things to consider. Obviously, like whomever listens to me speaking right now and actually is like has done that is gonna be like, there's nothing this guy can say. There's so much. I agree. There's so much, because you're dealing with many different protocols. You're dealing with complications where you have data that you need to share so that you can run a process, but also you cannot share everything, because then what you want is to keep it isolated. So it's fairly complicated, but in general terms, I think the main thing we said to focus on is on segmentation, which is basically, it does not mean to separate everything. You can't anymore. But what you need to do is make sure, for example, that nothing that's critical gets exposed to the internet. If there's any type of exposure, as controlled as it is, that then you have like full visibility into what goes on in there, so that you can immediately take action at different steps. Internally, you can separate and segment into different layers of security. So for example, when I was talking about Triton case, this safety instrument system is like a super secure network. Probably there might be one that's less secure, that's controlling the building of a facility, that should not run in any way in any type of connection. Talking about segmentation, there was this fun case. We don't know if it's true, but it's one of those that caught attention. It's a Reddit case, like where someone went and posted it, something that normally would not go out. We don't know if it's true, but it sounds like, based on the description, that it was someone saying that there was coffee machine that they just installed in the office, and they were having some problems with the process. Well, they were trying to figure out, basically they discovered that there was some connection with the coffee machine. And that was basically making their jobs impossible. And they were just kind of like lashing out on that. But it's very fun, because you read all the case, all the details, and like, oh, whoa. So actually they did. So careful, like segmentation matters.
Like our coffee machines.
But yeah, so segmentation would be the main one. The second one, which is again, this one is super complicated, but it's having visibility. So what that means is, for example, if you know that you're using specific protocols and how you're using it, you need to be looking into that data and make sure that you are aware of the anomalies that happen. To a certain extent, anomalies can happen, like any emergency is an anomaly, so it's okay, but then you need to be aware. And the problem is that since you deal with different protocols, oftentimes looking into this data is not as easy. You need specialized products, you need to generate different setups, you need to do many different things. But at least in some of the main attacks that we've seen, that could actually help prevent, because one thing we saw in some of these attacks is that they were using Python, like the programming language, to compile and to run the malware, which oftentimes is not accepted in energy facilities. So, for example, if you were able to see that there's an executable that's running in Python, immediately you should be able to tell, this is weird. Like, there's no reason why I should have it there. So those type of things where any type of anomaly, you need to be looking into that. And again, it's a ton. Big processes, big visibility. But that's probably where I would focus most of the effort.
Now it brought me to just a thought, which I think in every single talk, interview, article, people need to talk about AI. Do you think AI actually amplifies the risks? Or, I mean, probably you were asked this already, like, for the past year. Maybe just to add it,
The most like generic response for AI that I can come up with is AI is a tool. So the same as any other tools. Like the same things you've always seen. There's always, like probably some years ago, someone would have asked you, like, what if I have a computer? Can that make an attack easier? What if I have better computer than yours? What if I have a computer that can break this encryption? What if I can go like that forever. So the trick in here is, I don't think that AI in itself is a risk in itself, but definitely it increases the capabilities we have for good and for bad. So now the trick is, the point is to make sure that we focus the same effort on how are we going to use it for good, so that by the time someone finds a terrible way of using it, like for everything in the world, then you can go and basically counter like that progress, which is the history of cybersecurity, right? Like there's something new, then you find a way to stop it. There's something new, you find a way to stop it. That would be kind of like my quick summary. Yeah.
From CCTV cameras to elevators, so OT systems are integrated into daily life, although not maybe everyone knows about it. So what practical steps can organizations take to secure these devices?
I mean, in general, I would mind saying the ones I brought up, which is kind of like of segmentation and visibility, but there are some additional things that you could do. I think particularly, the first one is when people say you need to know what you have so you can defend it. That's super cliche, but it's actually true. And the point is, like, we are aware of organizations that don't even know what the devices are. This was one of that like eye-opening situation several years ago, but like working with a fairly sensitive and interesting organization, and then just realizing that basically, there was no inventory. There was no idea of where things were. It was like, okay, let's create one. Let's just go and send people in the field. Let's try to count what we have, try to get the numbers right too. Because all of that data, all of that information is very important. If you want to do a response, for example, let's assume that you're doing a very critical process, producing something. And then the point, you see a change. First of all, you need to figure out like why there's a change. And if you don't even know what devices you have, what's incorporated in the process, how it's structured, going back to figure out that process, it's going to be a nightmare. And even if you knew, like we actually released some years ago a framework for what we call forensics for OT. And the reason why you need a framework for forensics for OT is basically because it's, again, different. When you go and look into a computer, you go and look at the same logs. Whatever you call it, like Windows, Linux, Mac, whatever, you're going to be looking into logs. You're going to be looking into certain processes. You're going to see what's running in there. But when you go and look into OT, every device is different, and they have what they call for example, real-time operating systems, RTOS, which are fairly specific. Can be for a specific brand. Can look entirely different. So you basically have to get into the device almost and try to figure out what happened there. Oftentimes that might take communicating with the vendor, for example, because who knows the device better than the vendor? So in that framework, we were adding all of that information that you need to know what the process is, what are the pieces involved, then you need to know what are the specific devices in there, then you need to know who should you contact if something happens and who can help, who has the knowledge. And then from there, if something happens, you are actually able to do a response. Otherwise, it can get super complicated. And the second one, which is much easier, like the first one was kind of like an asset and vulnerability management almost. Okay. The second one is an exposure for surface management. So one of the things that we see right now, probably not for big companies, but mainly like smaller, ironically, for example, water facilities count as smaller because there's very few investment in security, is that you can see a ton of exposed things on internet where you can just literally go into a browser. If you know how to look, you're going to find it. You can use a specific software like Shodan, like, whatever. And then you can go and find exposed things. And it is, as a researcher, it's fun to go and see what there is. But as someone that doesn't have a ton of skills, they're just trying to figure out how to mess up, like on the hacktivism side and whatever, they just go. And if they find it, they're going to move it, period. So whenever there's something exposed, normally there's a use case, which is remote controlling, which you can't be there all the time. So it makes a lot of sense. But you need to be extremely mindful of what that entails and how to keep it protected.
So then what role do the governments play in supporting OT security?
There's a lot of that happens more at the private level. Like if you're talking about manufacturing, like oftentimes big manufacturing companies are going to have something very private. Then you're going to have something more like at the public level, like water, energy, services, things that are more like critical in that sense. What role do they play? First of all, I mean, we have all the compliance and regulation. We have, for example, in the US, they have NERC CIP for energy. In here, we have like the NIS directives with some guidance, and every country has to apply. There's like a ton of frameworks in that sense. There's also big industry frameworks that you have to apply anything. I would say the first thing is that type of regulation is very helpful, particularly to make a baseline, like a baseline of security. It is not going to protect anyone, but it's going to make sure that at least there is the interest and it's enforced that someone's going to do it. The second one, though, is kind of like on information sharing, which I think that's something also that we've seen like increasingly very interesting, like cybersecurity centers in different countries, having this communication with industries and trying to get all this information from the intelligence world, trying to put it together and try to work with organizations to tell them this is what you should do, how you should do it, this is what's going on, how can we protect, how can we help you respond when something happens. The most important thing is, there were the two, the one on enforcement and the second one on communication. Having someone to talk to, like when that happens and I don't know what to do, who can I call? Who can help me? Yeah. And that is where our governments right now are playing a very, very important role.
What do you foresee as the next big challenges for OT security?
One of them is simply the fact that it has, like something I mentioned earlier, that it was like became from something of very complex malware, very specialized, into something very simple, where you develop a small component that has the OT piece, whatever you want to do, and then you have an actual operator that has these toolkits, and then go and let's assume figure out how to do phishing, so then they can get access, and from that access they can go and find the information. They find what devices, and they use one from a list of 100 tools that are very commonly used in OT. Then, kind of like that type of attack that is now involved, like actually like work on that on top. I think that's one of the big challenges that's going to happen, because a lot of these devices do not operate, like these protocols are not secure. If you can interact with it, if you drop an executable that can use Modbus, nothing's going to stop you. It's going to do whatever. So you're not compromising the device, but rather giving him or it different instructions. That's one thing we've seen in recent attacks. And I think that is one of the scariest things, because when there's intentionality, that means you can do it, and there adding that layer of security is difficult. Another thing I think is in the side of virtualization. So actually, when you have, for example, you start applying this kind of like virtualization ideology, which is great, because then you don't have to invest so much like in the physical devices. You don't need like all this physical space. You can have so many computers in one server, whatnot. That is great from an efficiency perspective. That is great from multiple perspectives, even from security, if you're taken care of. But if the actor is able to compromise a single, let's say, point of system, or at least smaller point of system that is not physically constrained, then there is a higher possibility of attack. So I think it was 2023, we released this research we work with Ukraine. It was funded by UK government, I believe. There was an attack, again, energy facility, and basically they used OT, I'm going to call it software or equipment, that was used to control the physical process, and that was basically virtualized. So by getting access to these, let's say, like virtual servers, then from there you can go and execute the process to do something that the process is not intended to do, and then there is the attack. That is, I feel, one of the biggest challenges, because then the least physical separation we have, the easiest it is to do something remote with the process. Doesn't mean it has to happen. It doesn't mean it's bad. It doesn't mean it's terrible. But then you really need to be mindful about what you're doing and how it looks like.
Great. All right. Then I think actually it's a perfect ending for the podcast. And thank you very much, Daniel, for coming. And it was a pleasure. Also, you made OT, which seems a very complex topic, sound very easy. And hopefully people will enjoy listening to it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the invite.